welcome fellow Wasteland survivors. I'm Dean. Thanks for stopping in for today's video, A Wastelander's Guide to Nuked Flora. Where to find them, how to stabilize them, and what you can craft with them afterwards. Now for the first part of today's video, I'd like to discuss what nuked flora is, how to tell the difference between the plants, and where to find them. So let's go ahead and get started. The first time that you access a chemistry workstation, you may have noticed a category that said nuked flora, and when you checked it out there was probably nothing there. The reason is because just like most of the things that we craft in Fallout 76, you will have to discover the resource first, or find plans or recipes. Since there are no plans or recipes for nuked flora, we will have to discover each one of the 5 different flora types. Now there are several different plants, flora plants, that you can harvest to get one of these 5 different fluxes. Also, in energy ammo, you can see that we can craft fusion cores. And from the menu on the right hand side, we also see the 5 different fluxes that we'll need to craft a fusion core. And we're going to do that a little later in the video. To help make our search for nuke flora a little easier, let's make a quick stop over at White Springs Bunker. In the command center of the bunker, lying around, we'll find 5 different sheets of paper that list the different fluxes and all the different flora types that you can harvest to get that specific flux. Here we're looking at Flux Crimson, and we can see the several different flora types that we can get the Crimson Flux from. Here is the Yellow Cake Flux, and once again we can see a few different flora types that'll give us the Yellow Cake Flux. Now, you can only get access to this part of the bunker if you are a general with the Enclave. But I'm taking a few seconds here to look at each one of the papers, so that way, just in case you are not a general, you can still use these sheets as a reference to the different types of floras that you're going to need to find. Here is the Violet Flux, and in my opinion the Violet Flux is the #1 hardest flux of the 5 to find. Even though it has quite a bit of flora that we can get this flux from, this flora is scattered all across the map. It was hard to find large concentrations of those different types of flora to get the Violet Flux from. But we did quite a bit of testing, and we did find 2 locations that you can get an adequate amount of the Violet Flux. Here is the list for the Cobalt Flux, and once again, in my opinion, the Cobalt Flux is the 2nd hardest to find of the 5 different fluxes. If you're out looking for Cobalt or Violet Flux, you may want to consider joining a group. Therefore, your friends can pick the same plants, and you can double or triple up on those fluxes. Our final flux is Fluorescent, and as you can see, there are only 2 different flora types for Fluorescent Flux. The reason is because these 2 different flora types are in abundance all across the map. Therefore, I do believe the Fluorescent Flux and the Yellow Cake Flux are the easiest and most common to get out of all 5 fluxes. Once you've collected all these notes, keep in mind that in your Pip-Boy under Notes, you will be able to access them at any time. And this is a great way to reference what type of flux you're looking for and what plant that you'll get it from. We all know that White Springs Resort is the #1 spot for farming legendaries and XP, but it's also the #1 spot for collecting 4 of the 5 fluxes that we're looking for, Violet being the exception. There are a few plants here that give us Violet, but it's not near enough and they are glitchy. So let's drop a nuke here and collect some flux. we've dropped our bomb, it's time to start gathering as much raw flux as possible. Now keep this in mind, all flora is named, but once it's been affected by a nuclear blast, the name of that flora will change, and we'll see that here in a second. I like to start on the southeast side of White Springs along the road and the railroad track. In this area there's quite a high concentration of different types of flora. The first thing we see is a silt bean, which is now neutron pod. It gives us cobalt. Next is blackberry, which is called radberry. It gives us yellow cake. Next is red hot bloom, which is ash rose, and that gives us crimson flux. Now in this area there's quite a few of the blackberry bushes, so you will gather a lot more yellow flux than anything else around White Springs. The next plant we find is an aster. The aster is now called a ratty root. It gives us more yellow cake flux. Also, as you're looking around, you may find some gloam sap. Gloam sap gives us cobalt. Now, there's usually not that many sap trees in a blast area, but they are easy to see because of the blue glow that the sap now has, because it has become irradiated. The next area that we're going to search is really close to the service entrance of the White Springs bunker. In this trash bin area we would normally find brain fungus, but it's now called enlightened fungus, and it gives us crimson. Our next stop is a little farther north behind the housing located in that area. Here we'll find our first rhododendron, which is now called rhododendron, and that'll give us fluorescent flux. There are a lot of the rhododendrons scattered all across the White Springs grounds. Also, don't forget to check the water or swampy areas for any snaptails, which are now called crackletail. They give the raw violet flux. Now, keep this in mind in case you are looking for raw violet flux. You're just not going to find it at White Springs. It's the one flux out of the 5 that you're not going to be able to find enough of here. It's glitchy, and quite often all you get is just snaptails. Out of 7 times that we nuked White Springs, this was the only time that I was able to collect any violet flux. So even if your friends are helping you, you may not find enough of the raw violet flux to create one stable flux. Therefore, we're going to have to look for a new nuke location so that we can harvest the violet flux. But before we go do that, we're going to need to stabilize the raw flux that we've already gathered. Because the shelf life of raw flux is about 1 hour, we're going to want to do this as quickly as possible. Also, it's going to take 3 other resources to stabilize the fluxes that we've already accumulated. So let's go ahead, take a quick look at how many fluxes we've already gathered, and it looks like we've got 21 cobalt, 72 crimson, 23 fluorescent, 93 yellow cake. Now, the other 3 resources needed to stabilize our flux can be found on any dead enemies inside of the nuke location. They are glowing mass and high radiation fluids, and you can find them in the first aid category. The third one is hardened mass, and that is in the junk category. Now keep this in mind. If you group scrap your junk, you will scrap the hardened mass along with it, and it does create ultracite. So don't forget, you need to take your hardened mass out of your junk category before you scrap it, or you will end up with ultracite and not enough hardened mass to stabilize all of your fluxes. Also, before you start, don't forget to put in your super duper card, which will give you a 30% chance to get a double yield from anything that you craft. Alright, let's start stabilizing. First off, we can see it takes one glowing mass, one hardened mass, one high radiation fluid, but it takes 10 of each one of the raw fluxes to create one stable flux. And there we go, our super duper card is already procking. I also recommend to start off with the raw fluxes that you have the least amount of, just in case you happen to run out of or don't have enough of the other three resources. This way it'll ensure that you create as many as you can of the different stable fluxes. Also, if you have any of the glowing mass, hardened mass, or high radiation fluids left over, go ahead and save them in your stash box. For two different reasons. One, they have no shelf life. You can keep them for as long as you want. Second of all, they're worth a lot of caps at the vending stations. If you're collecting legendaries to get extra caps, don't do that. Collect these resources because they weigh very little and are worth a lot of caps at the vendors. And look at that, our super duper card has been procking like crazy. So let's see how many stable fluxes that we've actually created. And it looks like we got 3 cobalt, 8 crimson, 3 fluorescent, and 12 yellow cake. Now this is what I collected on my own. If you're in a group and your friends are helping you, you could get quite a few more of these stable fluxes. But if you're doing it by yourself, you may have to visit the nuke zone 2 or 3 times to get what you need. Alright, now that we've got 4 of the 5 fluxes stabilized, we still need to find one more flux, and that is the violet flux. After dropping several nukes in different locations, we did discover 2 areas that had a high concentration of flora that we could get violet flux from. The first one, and my personal favorite, is Fisher Site Prime. And in this area, you're going to find several patches or clumps of trees. Once you've discovered a tree line, inside of it you'll find mutated ferns, usually several of them. The mutated ferns are now called flash ferns, and this is where you're going to find a large quantity of violet flux. The reason I liked this area is because each one of these tree lines had several of these mutated ferns in it, which made it really easy to harvest the violet flux. In one trip to Fisher Site Prime, I by myself was able to collect 46 raw violet fluxes. The second location that we found that had a high concentration of violet flux was Harper's Ferry, but it was my least favorite of the 2 different drop sites. First of all, the nuke was dropped a little too far to the north, and we missed quite a few extra mutated ferns a little farther south. Second, a lot of the areas around Harper's Ferry was extremely dark, which made it very difficult to find the flash ferns. Because of that, we barely made it back to camp before they started to spoil. After one trip to Harper's Ferry by myself, I did discover 42 violet fluxes. Now, the final thing that really hurts Harper's Ferry for collecting violet flux, and that is there are very few enemies in the drop zone that you can kill to collect glowing mass, hardened mass, and high radiation fluids. As we can see here, we got very little killing the enemies there. Luckily, I've got some in my stash box, and we will be able to stabilize all of our violet flux. After dropping 3 different nukes, one on White Springs, one on Fisher Site Prime, and one on Harper's Ferry, I was able to collect and stabilize quite a few of the different fluxes. We've got 7 cobalt, 26 crimson, 16 fluorescent, 22 violet, 29 yellow cake. We should have a pretty decent amount of fluxes for crafting now, with the exception of cobalt. We could definitely use more of that. Alright, now for the final part of this video, let's see and talk about several things that you can craft or create using stable flux. First off, and I'm sure most of you are aware of this one by now, in the camp building system under miscellaneous structures, we will find the decontamination arch. It does take quite a few of the stable fluxes to create this. Now, I'm not going to build it, and there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, I feel it's an extreme waste of resources to build it. Second of all, there are a lot of cards in the perk card system that are set up and designed to help you deal with radiation. The next thing I'd like to talk about is rare and very hard to find, and that is the Jetpack for the X01 Power Armor. As of right now, there's only one way that we know of how to get it, and that's to be lucky enough to find it at the Enclave vendor at White Springs Bunker. Now, when you go to install it, it does show that it can be crafted, and it does take quite a few fluxes to create it. So that must mean that somewhere in the open world we should be able to find the pattern to create the Jetpack, possibly off the Scorch Beast Queen after we've killed her. If you access a Tinker's Workbench, you will find a category called Ultrasight Ammo. Here you can craft different types of ammo using ultrasight and stable flux. Now, you won't be able to fire this ammo type through any weapon unless you have found weapons or plans that will allow you to create the receivers for the different guns. You will also need tier 5 in Weaponsmith to be able to craft them. This ammo does give a pretty decent boost to damage. Alright, let's put our super duper card in and craft some fusion cores. Now, I know fusion cores are still pretty easy to get even after the nerf, but what's really cool about creating fusion cores with the stable flux is that you do get an extra 12% of a charge. Instead of 100, these fusion cores are now 112. Alright, thank you ladies and gentlemen for stopping in, hanging out with me today for the Wastelander's Guide to Nuked Flora, where to find it, how to stabilize it, and what to craft with it. I look forward to seeing you all on the next video and or stream, and just like always everyone, please, until next time, stay safe and peace.